So good evening, everyone. I'm here with Matt Jenkin from Moorcroft. We're going to talk this evening about bullying and harassment and a little bit about where things are at present with this. We're perhaps going to touch on how much it's happening, what the effects of that are, what the legal position is, and then what you can do about it. I should first of all introduce Matt. I've known Matt for probably 10-15 years now. He's from Moorcrofts Solicitors, and he's one of the most practical employment lawyers I know, which is useful. He doesn't just tell you what the law is, he tells you how it applies, and he's been a great friend, contact. So welcome, Matt, and good to have you with us this evening. Thanks for finding the time.
Hi, Tim. Pleasure to be invited on, and good to be speaking to you again about what is a really topical issue. All you have to do is pick up a newspaper and you will see some headlines on bullying and harassment in the workplace. So really pleased to be able to talk to you about it.
Yeah, I suppose we say good to be talking about it. It's unfortunate.
I wish we didn't have to talk about it, but it's still a live issue.
It happens far too much, and that perhaps sort of brings us neatly to the starting point, which is just how much it is happening. It's been, bullying and harassment have both been happening for far too long, far too often in organizations, and that still keeps on happening. Before this we were talking about some of the stats around it, and I was looking earlier on at some of the numbers from the Fawcett Society recently, and according to the Fawcett Society, 40% of women have been harassed in the workplace, and of those 40%, 25% have actually said, a few people say, well, actually, is this problem going away with lockdown? 25% say that problem's got worse with lockdown, and that's those sorts of numbers are reflected not just in sexual harassment, but across racial harassment and bullying as well. So, and I mean, recently we've seen the cases of racial harassment in cricket. And in sport, which is happening far too much. But we work across a number of sectors, and looking at some of those sectors in the NHS, consistently, around about 25% of staff would say they've been bullied in the last year. I was looking for some numbers in your profession, Matt, and I think 62% of female lawyers and 41% of male lawyers say they've been bullied. And 38% of women, 6% of men say they've been harassed. And according to the TUC, I think around about half of women have been harassed in the workplace. And the sad thing is, you end up across all of these things, bullying and harassment, with the majority of people not raising it. So again, coming back to the NHS stats, of the 25% of people who say they're bullied, only a third of people will raise that. And of the women who are bullied in the workplace, harassed in the workplace, around about 80% won't raise it, which are pretty dire figures.
I saw that Fawcett Society report, and part of me was surprised by the figure, because whenever I see that kind of 40% of women experience sexual harassment during their career, that's that should be an absolutely shocking statistic. But I think it just mirrors what we've seen, as you say, with the TUC report, with what we see kind of in the newspapers today, that unfortunately bullying and harassment hasn't gone away. And I think it was a bit of a wake-up call, certainly within perhaps the legal profession, on the back of the Me Too campaign, which is 2-3 years old now, because I think some complacency, certainly on sexual harassment, had kind of crept into the workplace, where I think if you'd asked lots of senior managers, they'd have said, no, it doesn't go on in our organisation. That's a antiquated idea. We're all over that. It just doesn't happen. And I think those reports came as quite a shock to a lot of employers, because it actually showed there was a big problem, and there still is a problem. And that's not really changed over the last couple of years, arguably. It's got worse during the pandemic, because that Fawcett Society report, I think, said something like 23% of those surveys said that they thought sexual harassment had increased for employees working from home during a pandemic. So it's certainly not got any better. And one of the things as an employment law, I get to read all the latest cases that are coming through, and there is a steady stream of cases coming through, which shows that employers have simply got this wrong. and aren't acting in the way that they should. You know, back end of last year, we saw the Jaguar Land Rover case involving a transgender employee who was bullied and harassed in the most appalling way. And I couldn't believe that Jaguar Land Rover in an employment tribunal trying to justify it or trying to argue that they'd taken all reasonable steps, because they clearly hadn't. So it's there, it exists. And certainly employers who think it isn't a problem, I suspect, don't know really what's happening in their organisation, particularly large organisations. But I think it cuts across for some SMEs as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, and we'll come on later on to what employers can do about this. But one of the things we repeatedly see is organisations who say, well, actually, overall, we sort of recognise those figures, but our organisation's different. And then you stack up everybody side by side and say, well, actually, not every organisation is different. And if you're, it's not if you're not seeing it's not happening, but that you have to reach out and really delve into your organisation and check it's not happening, and not just take the assumption that we haven't heard about it, so it's not there, because there are so many organisations who've said we've not heard about it. And then, as you say, you know, somewhere like Jaguar Land Rover, you wouldn't expect a brand like that to have the problem. It does happen, and you've got to reach out and check and put in place the systems and the processes to make sure that it isn't happening in your organisation.
Absolutely, I think there is that level of complacency where I think people will look at the Jaguar Land Rover case, would look at the Yorkshire cricket case, and just say, well, that couldn't possibly be happening in my organisation. And I would just challenge employers, and say, I know we'll get on to perhaps talking about that, but I would challenge employers just to not be drawn into that assumption, because the statistics show, the anecdotal evidence show, the case law shows this is a continuing problem that employers are failing to get to grips with to any sort of degree, I think.
Yeah, and you know, the effect when you come on to, you said the next thing we talk about is the effects of people, both on the employee and on the organisation. And you know, one of the things that you look at is the effects on the employee are, I mean, devastating on some people's lives. They go back home every day just feeling dragged down by work. You know, I mean, it causes people, eventually it causes some people to commit suicide. But if people don't commit suicide, the effect on their mental health, their well-being, their motivation at work, you know, and we'll touch on the legal aspects of this, but you know, you have a moral duty to make sure that you look after your people and you're not putting them in harm's way. And bullying and harassment is brutal harm. And you look at any of the stats around mental and physical wellness, and it plummets when people are being bullied and or harassed.
You know, when I'm talking to employers about this, it's difficult sometimes as lawyers, isn't it? Because you know, we're not always the moral arbiters of the argument, but yeah, there is that kind of moral issue, which is just fundamentally that employers should prevent this from happening, because it's something that, you know, in our society should be stamped out. But there's also, obviously, there's the legal reasons why employers should deal with this, and I can touch on those. But also, just from a retention and recruitment perspective, is out there at the moment. It's a prospective candidates market. You know, if you're an employer, you're fighting to get good people through the door. And I think employees are more savvy than ever than they have been about which employers they're prepared to join. And it only takes a few negative reviews on recruitment websites or a negative case going against you in an employment tribunal. I think you'll have an uphill struggle recruiting good people, because they don't want to join organisations that have got a reputation for this. So as well as that sort of moral imperative and a legal need, because you want to avoid getting sued, frankly, I think from a retention recruitment perspective, it's imperative. From an engagement perspective, within, you know, we know engagement can drive performance and success. All those reasons are why employers should have this at the top of their agenda to be looking at.
Yeah, and you know, the TUC again ran some numbers, and their estimate was that the cost to the average business is around £550 per employee per year. So if you employ 1,000 people, you know, the likelihood is that bullying and harassment is costing you somewhere north of £500,000. And it's, you know, it's easy to see how those, you know, people say, oh, is that true? But it's easy to see how those things stack up. You know, people leave more often. When they leave, it costs you anything between £10,000 and £30,000 to hire a new person. As you said, it's harder to recruit people because the word gets out on the recruitment websites and with social media and things. People's engagement, if they don't leave, you know, bullying and harassment causes such demoralization. You know, people's engagement in the workforce probably plummets by 20-30%. So, you know, your 20% of what you're paying them is being, you know, irrespective of the moral argument, and there is definitely a moral case for sorting this. You know, it is costing you an enormous amount of money if you're not nailing this. And then, you know, you only need 1 or 2 cases to end up in the hands of lawyers. And, you know, I hope all lawyers have a nice Christmas, Matt. But, you know, obviously you don't want to be paying money out to lawyers to sort out cases that you should have been able to spot in advance.
Absolutely. You know, there's a whole host of reasons why employers need to get a good grip on this and take some positive action to manage it within the workplace.
So yeah, I mean, we touched before, and you were talking about the legal side of things. John, you know, we said there's a strong moral case for the fact you should look after your people, and particularly that's one of the reasons we set up our business was, you know, realizing that when things get on social media, it's too late to control the news flow. So control it before things go wrong. But from the legal perspective, you know, where do businesses stand?
Yeah, bullying and harassment, it's quite a, you know, complex area of law, actually, because there isn't one overarching, you know, piece of anti-bullying legislation. Harassment probably is a little bit more protected in a formal sense, but really the protections come from 4 areas for bullying and harassment. So first of all, you've got your liability under the Equality Act. So that would be your failure to protect employees from harassment in the course of employment. So typically, you know, sexual harassment, harassment on the grounds of race, sexual orientation harassment, all those sort of things are kind of your Equality Act protected characteristics harassment. There's also protection under the Protection from Harassment Act. And actually, it's not a well-used piece of legislation for employers to be held liable, but there is the possibility under that piece of legislation for employers to be liable for the acts of their employees for committing harassment in the workplace. There's also some implied duties in the contract of employment. Things like you've got an implied duty to provide a suitable and safe working environment. You've also got a duty not to destroy mutual trust and confidence. And if you do, that'll expose you to potential constructive dismissal claims.
Right.
You've also got Health and Safety at Work Act, which is all around requiring employers to provide a safe place and a safe system of work. So what often happens if someone's been suffered, you know, badly as a result of being bullied and harassed in the workplace, you might find there's 3 or 4 different claims that are being run against an employer for that act, rather than kind of one overall arching claim. But let's be clear, those claims are really, you know, one, costly to defend in terms of legal fees because they're complicated, but also expose you as an employer to a huge amount of financial pain. That Jaguar Land Rover case, that employer, I think, was awarded £180,000 compensation.
Right.
Employment tribunals are prepared and do give some fairly high level compensation awards, and quite rightly as well. If you read that case, frankly, you wonder why, you know, sometimes you do wonder that perhaps it could have even been more, I think, for what went on. But there's a way of assessing what those damages are. But, you know, that's where the protections come in. So I think employers, there is huge legal liability for getting this wrong.
Yeah, I think from a layman's perspective, it seems to me that the courts have actually begun to realise what devastation this wreaks in people's lives, and just how much it can harm them. Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, I've got to say, when I was listening to all the reports on the Yorkshire cricket case, and I heard that, you know, the Yorkshire Cricket Club trying to pass off what had happened as banter. That's the type of thing that if you're running that defence in an employment tribunal, best of luck is all I can say, because I think employment tribunals are quite more than prepared to start looking at this in more and more detail, and just trying to pass this off as good-natured workplace banter, or hijinks or a bit of horseplay just simply won't wash these days.
Yeah. Well, then that brings us sort of neatly on to what you can do about this as an organisation, and what you should be looking out for, and where that goes. And I was thinking about this earlier on, and I think one of the first things I would advise organisations is to be really clear that there is no zero tolerance. There is zero tolerance. Sorry, that banter is you can't get away with it was banter. You have to be very, very explicitly clear that you are going to live to a set of high standards, whether it's racial harassment, sexual harassment, bullying. So I think that brings us neatly on to what you can do about this. And I would say, I think one of the first things there is to be very, very explicit that, about your values, and about a zero tolerance policy for bullying and harassment, and that things like, alleged banter, it is not good enough. And I think the second observation I would have on that is that the message has to start from the top in organisations. I mean, too often there's been a little bit of, no, that's okay, it was only, and it's, or that person's a high flyer, and we accept that from them. I think organisations have to say it does not matter who you are in an organisation. So that, looking back at the Ted Baker fiasco, the first time it happened, somebody should have taken him aside and said, that never happens again, or you will be out of this organisation. It doesn't matter where you are in the organisation. And I think senior managers have an obligation to pull up other senior managers. You can't expect the person who's not the receptionist to pull up the chief executive. The business doesn't work like that. And I think senior managers have to do that. So I think very, very clear policies, starting at the top, and zero tolerance from the outset. I mean, to me, that doesn't mean you march someone out of the door as soon as they cross the line, but it does mean you pull them up and make it very clear where you are. And sometimes you may be marching people out of the door, but
yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think there's a couple of good points you make there, Tim. I think first of all, that kind of demonstrable leadership commitment to a zero tolerance approach. I think that's key. It needs to be driven from the top. It needs to be visibly driven from the top, I think, to be successful. And that does mean senior leaders pulling up other senior leaders about their behaviour. And I also agree that it should be a zero tolerance approach. And absolutely, it doesn't mean that if someone oversteps the line, that automatically means that it's going to be dismissal and gross misconduct. It may be in certain circumstances, but it may be that it's actually, a warning, or it may be that it leads to an identification for a wider training need in an organisation. And I think sometimes employers think that, particularly if they're carrying out investigations into bullying and harassment, that I think they're frightened sometimes to actually find in favour of the employee, when actually all evidence points to the fact that they should, because they're concerned, frightened, worried about what will happen if, as an organisation, they put their hands up and say, yes, we didn't do as good a job as we could, and this person wasn't treated in the right way. Whereas I think what employers need to do is learn from that decision. And I think, that would be, they need to embrace that rather than run away from it. I think, when I saw that Yorkshire, again, I mentioned it because I think it raises some really good points. It seemed to me what they were saying is they admitted that some of these comments were made, but then highlighted that they thought it was banter and therefore didn't need to take any action. And I think that's a classic error in my part on these things, because I think, what they should have done is said, no, we think that was wrong, and actually we're going to take steps to address this. It didn't mean that necessarily everyone was going to be dismissed, but action could have been taken to resolve it. And that's a classic error, I think, is kind of leads into one of the things that I often see is employers not taking it seriously.
Yeah.
I know.
Sorry.
So the other point, just to say, I'm not taking it seriously, and also approaching it from a perspective of trying to disprove what the employer is saying. what the employee is saying, almost making it a very adversarial approach, and not really understanding that actually this could have gone on in an organisation.
Yeah, and you know, coming back to where we started about why people don't raise this, and we were saying that in your profession, you know, over half, close to half of people have been bullied or harassed. You know, I think that in the IBA found out that 82% of lawyers who'd suffered bullying felt that the outcome, it wasn't taken seriously, and that is something we see repeatedly, is people feel it's not worth raising this because it won't be taken seriously. I mean, the other reasons they won't raise it are, you know, they think it's going to really affect them negatively in terms of the career. Even your colleagues might turn on you because they start being more reticent about you. I think, as you say, when organizations do clearly take it seriously, then it will get other people stepping forward, and it also makes your values clearer to everybody else across the organization. And perversely, actually, some of the people who've overstepped the mark, if you have an intervention earlier on, they are probably in a better place themselves, because, you know, sooner than it happening 10 times, they get disciplined the once, or, you know, or they get retrained the once, rather than letting it drift. So you're probably doing nobody any favors for letting these things drift.
Oh, absolutely. I think you touched on that point with that kind of, I don't think it's an official term, but I call it that kind of superstar employee syndrome, which is, you know, you have very good performers who just get away with misconduct because they're very good performers, and employers and businesses need the sales, for example. Yeah. I've got some horror stories of superstar employees where, you know, minor acts of misconduct turn into major acts of gross misconduct, and employers then are stuck in a cycle of not being able to take action. And also, what happens then for the non-superstar employee who commits the same act? Are you going to take action against them? Because if you are, you're exposing yourself to an unfair dismissal claim, potentially, because you're not being consistent in your approach. So it kind of leads back to that zero tolerance approach. And again, I think, you know, one of the things that I think kind of leads on to what you were saying, Tim, which is kind of reporting of it, is how can employers encourage employees to report the complaints? Certainly from my perspective, I think it's making the complaint procedure transparent and open. But I know from the work that you guys obviously do that, and I've seen it more and more, there's kind of more innovative use of kind of hotlines where people can make complaints, where those complaints are going to be taken seriously. And I think that's an area where employers really need to look at, is how they can use perhaps technology to help employees bring forward concerns that they've got.
Yes, and you know, so we were talking about the ways to stop this, and we were talking about values and being very clear and having very clear procedures, but also, you know, some of these organizations that say at senior management level we didn't know what was going on. You know, parts of what we do are, I mean, first of all, it's very, very easy to survey people periodically to find out how they feel, whether they feel you're in the right place with respect to gender, and whether they feel if you're not in the right place, or if you get not in the right place, they can raise it. You know, those things are incredibly easy to do now if you make the commitment. It doesn't take a lot of time. And then recognizing that not everyone reports things in the same way. I mean, senior management often think it's easy, we've got an open door policy, and, you know, part of what we run is a system where people can raise things anonymously if they need. And that often gives, what we often hear from clients is, because you enable people to raise something anonymously, you've got a connection back, and you can encourage them to be able to step forward. Or if you can't encourage them to step forward, you can at least build up a picture that actually something's not working very well in the Basingstoke office. We need to delve a little bit deeper there, rather than putting the onus on the employees, making it safe for employees to raise things in the way they need. And sometimes that'll be stepping through your door, but sometimes you've got to recognize that, you know, if you've got a mortgage and a career, you don't necessarily feel you can do that, and accommodating those people, because most people want to raise this, most people want it to end, but not everybody feels they can march to the door of the chief executive or HR and do that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting, Tim, that you raised that idea of kind of regular surveys amongst the kind of your employees to kind of ascertain what the range of the problem actually is. One of the protections that we're going to see come in is particularly increased protection from sexual harassment. So they're going to make some changes to the Equality Act and increase the protection, particularly against sexual harassment in the workplace. Part of that will be a proactive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment. There isn't a proactive duty on them at the moment. That's going to be really defined in the code of practice, but it's likely that code of practice is going to cover things like making sure that you understand what's going on in your organization and you are surveying your employees regularly. It kind of takes us back to the beginning, doesn't it? Which is, I don't think sometimes employers really know what's going on the ground.
Yeah,
and those sort of surveys, I think, are going to be incredibly useful for finding out what's going on and then taking some targeted action.
Yeah, it's and you know, if you do it and everybody's fine, then great.
Great.
You know, if you can move on knowing, and also actually realizing that things can change quite quickly in organizations. I occasionally speak with organizations and they say, well, we run a survey every couple of years, and within that time you could have recruited, you know, 20% of new managers, and things have either got a lot better or a lot worse.
Yeah, that time point also, Tim, applies to one of the other things that I think employers should do, which is training, and they should provide up-to-date, relevant training across the workforce, and also to managers, and particularly to managers, in how to identify when there are issues and how to handle it when issues are raised, and that needs to be kept up to date. It can't become stale. In fact, there was a case relatively recently where an employment tribunal criticised an employer quite heavily for stale training, and I think making sure you're really drilling into the training requirements, making it relevant, keeping it updated is going to be key. So that kind of oh, we did something a couple of years ago, it isn't going to wash anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting towards the end of our time, Matt, but just
sure.
Sort of cycling back. Now, I think we talked about the fact this is still happening far too often. I think we had a chat about the fact it can have pretty devastating effects on employees. It also costs organizations a lot, both financially and reputation wise. You know, I think we then talked about some of the legal issues, and thanks for the contributions there and throughout this, and a few of the things you can do to make sure it doesn't happen. But I think the final thing would be, it is happening. Don't be complacent. And to anyone who's listened this far, I hope you've learned something this evening. If you want to contact either Matt or I, our details will be at the end of this video. And thanks for everyone's time. And Matt, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and it's been great.
Thanks, Tim. Absolutely enjoyed that. Thank you.